Hi, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I'm here today talking with Stephanie Prechter. Stephanie, thank you for talking today.
Sure thing.
Glad you're here.
Mhm.
Stephanie is a Michigan based artist photographer working to connect brain health with the power of the arts. Her background includes a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from Georgetown University. She also worked with U.S. Department of Ag's Foreign Agriculture Service and as a research associate with the Prechter Bipolar Research Team at the University of Michigan, as well as being involved with suicide prevention at both the state and local levels. Along with all that, she's worked with her family's foundation, and she also has completed a photography degree at Washtenaw Community College, is now working as a professional photographer, all the while focusing and continuing her work, focusing on brain health and the arts. Wow,
Mhm.
that's a lot.
Yeah.
Must keep pretty busy, I would imagine.
Well, and it's definitely been a lot of detours, so.
Oh, well, that's kind of the way it is for all of us, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, let's start off with you grew up near the Detroit River and the Great Lakes. So, how did that experience growing up there impact you both in your childhood and as an adult now?
Yeah, so I grew up downriver, at an island in the Detroit River, and, so for 35 years, I felt like I had a relationship with the river because it was right outside my window, and we would go boating, and, my brother would be a big ice fisher, and, jumping into the river and swimming and lighthouse jumping and all these things, but, not until I picked up a camera and, started photographing the river did I really establish strong, um, connection to this water, and, it was an awakening.
Uh, how would you describe that connection?
Uh, the word that comes to mind is just peaceful. It feels comforting. I think water has taught me the power of surrender, and it's given me freedom. It feels like everything is in flow. You're familiar with Bruce Lee when he says, "Be like water." And so it's shapeless and formless, and it has so much power. It can be really gentle. And at the same time, when it forms, obviously, when it gets into ice, you can see the hardness and the rigidness of it. So there's a ton of reasons why I love water, and I think it's in a relationship that keeps growing, and I keep learning from it.
Sure, sure. Well, how did photography do that for you? How did photography help make that connection?
Yeah, so like you said, I finished the photography degree at Washtenaw Community College, and at the end of the program, you take on a class called Projects, and I really wanted for water to be my project focus, but I needed to narrow it down, and so I was sitting at home next to the river, and I looked out, or no, sorry, I was on a boat with a friend, and a freighter had passed by, and I did have my camera with me. And when the freighter passed by, I started making pictures, and I I thought of the Great Lakes project. So I could photograph the Great Lakes. That could be my project. Uh, and um, and so yeah, that's how it started. And I'm sorry, you asked how did photography
Yeah. How did photography facilitate that connection?
facilitate it, right? So as soon as I started photographing this freighter, it kind of led into the rest of I fleshed out my project, and I made these different trips to different parts of the state. And I connected with individuals, and I learned about, lighthouse keepers, and um, I learned about the Milwaukee Clipper out in Muskegon. And I felt like as soon as I picked up photography and I picked up this project, I instantly, um, it felt like it was this new thing that I just discovered, like a planet, and I had all of it. Like I just needed to open up the cover of it, and then there was all the stuff underneath. Does that make sense?
Sure. The word that,
Yeah.
and I don't know if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the word that comes to mind a little bit is the word awe. Like, oh my gosh,
Yes.
what's going
Yeah. Yeah. Awe and wonder, and again, this wasn't something I was 35 when I picked this up, and the river was right out my window for that long. So granted, it was probably just the right time. But this will be a lifelong project. I feel like the Great Lakes project, the river and all the lakes, I sort of I use it as an analogy for my own wellness. And I know we're going to get into talking about brain health a little bit later. Uh, but I feel like if I make a connection to this resource and I value this resource and I see the interconnectedness of the lakes in relationship to the rest of the planet, to that ecosystem, it's just it's a really good um, like visual, you know.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, as you're describing your reaction to water, you're using, you use words like awe, wonder, peaceful, comfort, surrender, freedom. Those are big words, right? I mean,
Yeah.
those are big concepts, and it reminded me of a talk I recently heard you give online at the this past October at the Southern Wayne County Regional Chambers Women of Achievement Award. You gave the keynote there, and
Mhm.
during that talk, you talked about using the phrase "this big picture why." What did you mean by that phrase, "big picture why"?
Yeah. So in preparing for the talk, I really wanted to share share a little bit about my detour and all these different places that I had been leading me to this bigger why. And so it's a tough question to answer. But for the most part, my background, as you mentioned, was in suicide prevention, bipolar research. And the reason being is because my dad died by suicide when I was 21. I was given a diagnosis of bipolar. And then uh, brain health is a term I use. I don't use mental health. I say brain health because I feel as if this is a brain health issue. And we can talk more in depth about that. But uh, I was never growing up. I never really understood where my path would take. I didn't, say I'm gonna be a doctor when I grow up. I'm gonna be a veterinarian. I didn't have like an idea. Um, and I think not until recently did I discover all these dots that I've witnessed, I guess, been exposed to up to this point, have led me to work in brain health arts and finding the connection between the power of art and brain health and how we develop as human beings based on art. Um, and so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned these little points or little moments in your life, sort of collecting them at one down the road. So we've talked a little bit about growing up on the water in the Detroit River. We've talked a little bit about the Great Lakes. Um, you mentioned brain health. Um, let's talk a little bit about the journey that you sort of started. You get a little bit more in depth into the idea of brain health. What do you mean by that? And how does that connect with the arts, and then we'll bring in some of those other points later, but let's start with
Sure.
brain health.
What do I mean by the brain health?
Yeah.
So I think I was first introduced to mental health when I was 18. I had a depressive episode going away to college. I Not 3 months into my first semester, I got to the point where I wasn't functioning at all, and I was admitted into the hospital. So it was my first experience on the psych ward, and uh, yeah, that was. I mean, that it took me at least a year to get back to you know um, I would say myself completely. And I think when I woke up from that experience, it was such an awakening for me, and I felt kind of like this urge to get my life back in order, and get back online again. And getting into that, I had no experience with mental health. Like growing up, we never talked about what that all meant. And then I did get back on track. And then when my dad died, uh, 3 years later, by suicide, again, that was completely new for us. I had never lost anyone to suicide. I didn't know what that meant. Uh, and so I still was in the mental health space, meaning I, had the diagnosis, and after my dad passed, I would be hospitalized a number of times. I did ECT, which is electroshock therapy. It's pretty extreme. It definitely benefited me. But my time with therapy and in hospitals was pretty grueling. And not once did anyone say to me, we need to talk with you about your brain,
Mm.
because the medication that we're prescribing you is essentially influencing your brain, which then influences your habits and your emotions and your function. And so I want to bring up a mentor in the space. His name is Jeremy Richmond. I referred to him in my talk. He's a neuropharmacologist. And maybe 5 years ago, this was a little bit after I picked up photography. Uh, he introduced the concept of brain health. And when he shared about it, he said that it was something tangible. You can see the brain. We can explore the brain. There's 100 billion neurons in the brain. There's all these things that happen, and each one of us is really unique. But it's almost like the outer space, that we need to start exploring. And um, again, it's making the intangible tangible. And for me, it was revolutionary, because I felt as if it gave me back my power. I when learning about the intricacies of this organ and understanding, meditation, that's not something that, just like cute for people to talk about. That's actually a serious form of retraining your brain. And it was something, yeah, sure, in hospital, people, they would introduce it. And we did have an art cart that would come around. So these concepts were around, but I didn't feel like it was something that was integral to my care.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so if that's the story that's kind of gotten you to this point, what's the connection between brain health and the arts?
So the connection is, again, growing up, I was creative and I was an artist, and my opa, my mom's dad, was an artist, and so I had it in my blood. My dad, obviously, innovator, engineer. That's a form of art, and but I never looked at it as a therapy, and I never looked at it as a viable career. I never looked at it as something that would connect me to culture and to other people. Um, and so when I undergrad, I did studio arts minor, and I was exposed to multimedia. And actually, when my dad passed, I withdrew from all of my other classes, and the university that I was at allowed for me to stay in my art class, because they knew that it would help me work through this grieving. And
Sure.
so I worked on a website in my dad's honor and his memory, uh, and um, and then I graduated and I worked at Department of Agriculture, and I went out to San Francisco, and I was pursuing a degree in advertising, and so arts was a part of that. But I was not linking the arts with my brain health yet. And so after I moved back home to Michigan, I got really sick out in California, moved back home to Michigan, and I was hospitalized in Michigan, and then started to do the research with our bipolar research team. I then worked in outreach. I still wasn't connecting the two, and I wasn't working on my art. Then I decided to take classes at Washtenaw. And I first took a graphic design course, and then I went into photography, and the arts started coming along, right? And then as soon as my seminar class was over, I took an entrepreneurial certificate, and that's where the brain health work was starting to morph with my artwork. And because on the side, I work with my family foundation, and I would give talks, at Wayne State, to clinicians, social workers, and I would show my photography as a form of education and awareness.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you know this, but there's a gamut of color in every photograph, right? It's called a histogram, where you have the highlights and the shadows. And uh, for someone who's been diagnosed with bipolar, which again, I'm not big into labels, but that was the diagnosis. It's an interesting medium to pick up. in photography because you have highlight and shadow. And
Mm.
essentially every picture has to have both, right? You have to have the gamut. And so in studying photography, in essence, I was really studying my own psyche. I was reframing my world
Mm,
on a daily basis.
sure.
Yeah.
So let's take this a step further then, because you've had in your work you've started to see the or have been seeing the convergence of brain health and the arts and water, or more specifically the Great Lakes. How do all those sort of fit together then now?
Lord, you know, I'm going to say that God works in mysterious ways, and I feel like um, I always say I'm in a very unique position, and I am filled with gratitude for for all of these different pieces. So you have brain health, which is a lot of the times, you know, that's science based. People talk about the science behind brain health or research and psychiatry and psychology. Um, with the arts, you have, I believe, there's more humanity, sort of like freedom, a curiosity, a wonder. With the Great Lakes, I have an instant connection with environment and nature, appreciation thereof, um, and then is, you know, suicide prevention work. That's honoring life and quality of life, and I feel like I'm still in process, sort of mixing it all up, but I think it's coming together.
Sure. Well, one of the ways, as I understand it, that you are working on with some other folks in bringing this together is a beginning group called Great Lakes Inspired. Is that correct?
That's right.
So talk a little about what the beginning visions of that is.
Yeah. So back when COVID first started, I started thinking about ways in which we can bridge the arts with sciences to create connection. And you know, how can I leverage whatever it is that been involved with uh, to help with those efforts? Now, this is kind of risky for me because I tend to get visionary, and my expectation gets a little grand. But the idea, I met with Susan White, who's the administrator for the refuge. She's been a friend for a couple years, and then
All right, the refuge. Could you say what you mean by that? I mean, is that
oh, it's the International Wildlife Refuge that's based in Detroit River.
gotcha? Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, uh, and Susan's awesome. And then there's Dave Dempsey, who you're familiar with, and I think he was on your podcast.
Yep.
And so Dave, Susan, and I just met for a little while, brainstorming what this would look like. And now we have a small group, and you know, including yourself and John Hardig, and you know, all of us are passionate about the work that we're doing. And again, we're looking for opportunities to share more of this information and to encourage people to become stewards of the environment, and to start looking at things in a different light, and to start combining these themes of brain health and art and environment.
Sure. Well, when we talked, and I'm going to try to bring in yet another element because all this stuff is really fascinating, how to me at least, how it sort of interacts with each other. But one of the when we talked earlier, you and I listed these all off earlier: peace, comfort, surrender, freedom, awe, wonder. Um, those could also be sort of seen as spiritual concepts as well. Do you think that there's a spiritual aspect to this convergence of water, the Great Lakes, brain health, the arts?
Most definitely. And I really feel as if, I mean, we're all on a spiritual journey. And I'm really open-minded with with faith in general. I think it's a very personal thing. My parents had my both of my parents have a great faith. Um, I can remember a lot of different moments in our lives when they were faithful, good and bad. And So I owe it to them that I have that grounding. Uh, and so in terms of this work, uh, I do a lot of writing in addition to my photography, and I think I've written quite a bit about what Carolyn Mace calls spiritual madness. So anytime the times that I've fallen into depression, I don't, I, I don't want to say that I fight that. I want to embrace it and understand it, better understand it. And I really do believe that um, it's a form of spiritual inventory
Mm,
and trying to figure out, what, like kind of coming back to your core self. Uh, and so, I mean, the question is a big question, and I think to try to unpack it would take a bit, but for the most part, I think spirituality really is about being open and being curious.
mm, sure. Well, one of the things that about your work that's been interesting to me, well, lots of things been interesting, but one in particular, when we talk about our connections to the Great Lakes, and a lot of times it's this idea of healing. We want to heal the Great Lakes. We want to make things better because we've done lots of damage over the years. But I see your work as sort of flipping that a little bit and saying, what can the Great Lakes do for us in terms of healing? Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, and I mean, it's synergy. It's what do you call it? When there's a symbiotic relationship.
Sure.
So there has to be this give and take. And I think that it's on one hand we get maybe over eager as to what can we do to help, and then we don't really sit back and really listen to the environment,
Mm,
or really watch it and observe it, and it has its own cycles. Resilience has been a huge theme in my life up to this point, and I think resilience is something that we see all the time in nature. And so, to your point, I feel as if we have a lot to learn in terms of patience, the resilience, the understanding, appreciation, uh, yeah, from our lakes.
sure, sure. Well, I like that. That's a nice place to sort of end this, because I think that idea of a relationship that is both, we both give and receive, a mutuality of that, is a theme that actually I've come across quite a bit in these conversations with folks. So that's great.
Hmm.
Well, Stephanie, I really appreciate the time today to talk. This has been great,
Hmm.
and I'm hoping we can visit again some other time, maybe, and explore these concepts a little more.
Definitely, I would love it.
All right, you take
Mhm.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.